Two handouts, one from last week, the article by Peter Steinfeld, which will enable me to avoid citing a lot of statistics. It's there. Read the Steinfeld's article. I think it's just must reading for people who are interested in this topic as a beginning. So that's why I've been. And for those of you who are, shall we say, tempted by that hors d'oeuvre.
Where's your hors d'oeuvres?
I have 6 months to go.
Metaphorically speaking,
Darn.
there is a bibliography. But again, just a smattering of, there's a whole industry behind that list. But I will be citing some things this morning that you may want to read more about, and some of those are, as you can see, available online, or at least readily available. So I commend that to you. Now, the purpose of this series of talks is, as the title suggests, to rethink secularization. Rethinking implies second thoughts, taking a second look, trying to make sense of something that we thought we understood in a new way, in a fresh way. And the reason for this series of talks is because that's happening. That's happening primarily in the academic world, but not just in the academic world. This is a very hot topic in the social sciences, more broadly in the humanities. Rethinking, and you can see it from the literature there. Those are just some of the best things. Book after book, article after article, and I'm trying to introduce that into our conversation here at Lewinsville, and I introduce it into our conversation at Lewinsville, as I said last week, for the following reason. It seems to me that it is essential for us, as we think strategically, as we do in this church, about our mission, to think about, well, what exactly are the assumptions we're making about the world out there? And you will hear all the time, in sermons, in committee meetings, the secular world. We're relating to a secular world. And I suppose if you had to summarize the whole point of this series of talks, if it gets boring, here's the bottom line. It's more complicated. It's a lot more complicated than that, and the complications matter. That's the other thing. They're not just, they're not just matters of, dare I say, academic interest. They're matters of practical interest as well. Now, in a little while in this talk, I'm going to explain why things are more complicated now than they were, say, back in the 1960s or the 70s. Not everybody in this room is quite at the same age, but those of us who can remember the 60s and the 70s and what was going on then probably have in our minds a certain way of thinking about this topic. I'll refer to that later more specifically. But it's different now. It's different now. And that's what I want to try to explain. Why is it different today? Why is it different, amazingly, about 50 years later from the 1960s? Now, before I get to that, however, those of you who have heard me talk before know I like to contextualize things historically. I think more often than not it really helps. You see things better when you see them in historical perspective. So let me start with a few comments on that. And some of these build on things I said last time. So if you weren't here last time, you get a quick summary of things that were already discussed last time. What do I mean by secularity? What do I mean by secularization? First point. Absolutely crucial to have some clarity about it. Sometimes that term, that idea, is associated, I think, too narrowly with questions of belief and unbelief. Do you believe in God or not? Now that's part of it, but I think that's far too narrow for getting at the thing we're trying to explain, to understand this morning. I want to use it in the broader sense, which I think, as I say, will help to get at the existential aspect. I think secularity is worldliness. Let me repeat that. Secularity is worldliness. Or to quote one of the great theological sources on this, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who near the end of his life in his famous Letters and Papers from Prison anticipated a world in which, and this is the way he characterized it, people would live as though there were no God. I hope you see the difference. As though there were no God. And he almost implied there, he came pretty close to implying that he was a deeply devout man. That's the interesting thing about this. Pious, devout man anticipating that circumstance. He almost came pretty close to implying that that was just the drift of modern life, that even if you went to church, you were pulled in that direction. You were pulled in that direction in everything from the practice of medicine. You know, how many of us, when we have a medical problem, would be content? I realize I'm opening up a can of worms here. Would be content simply to rely on prayer. How many of us? Probably not many. Most of us, we want a good health plan. And we want a good health plan. Why? Because we get access to what? Medical professional. You see what I'm getting at. Just another little comment on that. I said this last week, but I think it's worth repeating. I talked to a pastor not long ago who was basically he was an interim pastor at the church, so he could sort of take a snapshot and then move on. And he was very appreciative of the congregants in this church where he had been the pastor, but he said they're so worldly. They're so worldly. They go to church, but they're so worldly. Well, that's what I'm getting at. In other words, and I hope you see my point. You can be a good church-going person, but be very, very worldly. Well, that's being pulled in the direction of secularization, being in the direction of secularity. Now, the theory that I'm referring to up here, and that's the background for this whole conversation, comes from a great movement in the history of thought and the social history of the modern world, and that's the Enlightenment. If you read about the American founding, you'll hear references to the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson was an Enlightenment intellectual. Ben Franklin was, I think. The Enlightenment, a movement in the 18th century, sort of flowing out of the scientific revolution, and in the Enlightenment, big names, Hume, Kant, really important seminal figures in the history of ideas, tended towards the following view. As the world becomes more modern, it's going to become more secular. Just is. Just a fact of nature. As the world becomes more modern, it's going to become more secular. I know there are plenty of experts out there, literally in this room, on development who are going to say, what do you mean by modern? Well, let me try to pin that down, too, just real quickly here. And I'll just pause it. I think we all know to some extent what it means to be modern. In the sense I'm using it, it means above all a way of life founded on modern science and technology. I said last week, just think about all the machines that we rely upon for breakfast, for getting here. We sort of all this machinery, creating a certain way of life. So modern science and technology and modern life is, boy, more and more mechanized in that way. Well, along with that came, with the Industrial Revolution, come all these other things: an increasingly educated workforce, an increasingly educated society, more urbanization, a mass politics as opposed to that, sort of pre-modern politics that we associate with aristocracy. Anyway, that's a good part of what it means to be modern, to live in a scientific, technologically advanced, sophisticated, urban, increasingly educated. You see what I'm getting at. Now, the idea was the more people are drawn in that direction, the more they're going to be secular. Now, that meant, in Jefferson's mind, as I said last time, two things. And Jefferson was kind of generous on this. I mean, some of those French Enlightenment guys were just snotty about this. They said, religion is doomed. Full stop. It's gone. 100 years, certainly max 200 years down the road, they're not going to do that superstitious nonsense. They're not going to go to temple. they're not going to pray. They're not going to, very important indicator here, they're not going to engage in religious rites at important moments in life. Just think about how powerful a symbol it is. New baby in the family. As a grandfather, I'm very attentive to these things. New baby in the family. Is that baby baptized? I mean, that's a profound statement that a family makes, even if they're nominally, just nominally Christian or whatever. That's a statement. And by the way, one of the things that indices of secularization is they don't. They don't. Or another one. Very interesting issue. What about the end of life? Increasingly secular society presumably is one in which whatever the rite is at the end of life, it's not religious. Now, the prediction was stated sometimes with kind of breathtaking, just breathtaking confidence. Religion is doomed. Or the other possibility, which Jefferson, I said he was more generous, Jefferson's view was that what is going to come is not if just unbelief, it will be rational religion. One of the great ideas of the 18th century, and what he meant by that was Unitarian. He actually predicted that within a generation, middle of the 19th century that would be, within a generation, most of the American people would be Unitarians if they believed anything at all. It's kind of, that already should cause you to have some interesting thoughts. Now, that then develops into, I say this is somebody who was educated as a graduate student in political science, into a very strong theme in the social sciences. One of my great sources, many of you know, is Max Weber. Max Weber said we're entering a world that's disenchanted. And Weber, who I think had very, very complicated feelings about this, again implied that, well, modernization leads to secularization. It just does.
Last week you said about the secularization theory, you said religion is best understood as a substitute technology or a primitive technology.
Yeah.
That stuck with me. That kind of caps off what you're...
Well, thank you. That's what I said toward the end of my talk last time. That's the premise running through all of this. You have to ask the question, if people keep saying over and over again, religion is doomed, why? And I think running through it is the assumption that it's not quite as simple, but the core of it is that religion is a primitive technology, a substitute for a better technology, and presumably in modern societies you get better and better and better technology, so why do you need it? Why would you? For the longest time, if you look carefully, I think that was the operative assumption. And more and more that's sort of being flushed out, if I can put it that way, being thrown into sharp relief. But it was sort of taken for granted. Now, I'm gonna leap so fast it's probably malpractice on my part, but I'm gonna leap real quickly here through a very complicated issue in order to get to the thing that matters most to us. What has been the empirical evidence? I mean, people have been saying this, as I say, since the 18th century. Since the days of Thomas Jefferson. They've been saying some version of this or another. So what has been the empirical, and they've been saying it and saying it and saying it. I remember, let me just repeat it, it's so fixed, it's so much a part of my thinking, I can't help but repeat it. This professor of mine in graduate school said flatly in a seminar in comparative politics in the early 1970s, you guys, that were all guys, you guys, as you think about your careers, don't worry too much about religion because it's not going to be that important in politics. Well, in fairness to him, he could not anticipate. But he said it. That's sometimes people speak a little too casually in those settings. But he said it, and of course I'm still remembering it years later. He's now deceased. I've oftentimes thought, what an interesting conversation.
Yeah, well, this is probably the most fatal phrase in the social sciences is if current trends continue.
Well, yeah, but that's what should have been said. That's what should, and was not said. It was, guys, you know. And this was the thing that occasioned it, of course, was this was a whole class devoted to literature that we were supposed to be absorbing on religion and politics. And it was sort of, he was saying in effect, you know, it's very important. He was conceding. You know, for the longest time, if you wanted to predict voting behavior in the United States, one of the most important things was religious identity. If somebody said, I'm a Catholic, especially living in a certain place, you could predict with pretty good regularity. Now, of course, there were other things, class and so forth, but religion was really important. And he was saying, in effect, those days are behind us, or at least they're fading. Now, here's the sweeping generalization I want to make that's probably, as I say, malpractice, but I'm going to say it anyway because I believe it. I mean, if we had weeks, I could go into detail, but we don't. All the way through this long period, from the 18th century when these claims were being made, all the way up to the 1960s, when I think something dramatic happened that began to alter the terms of discussion. The evidence was mixed. The actual evidence was mixed. In the United States, beyond the United States, the evidence was mixed, and for the following reason. There were things you could point to that confirmed the secularization thesis very nicely. One very important, actually two elements of the same thing. Urbanization tended to be conducive to secularity. Just was. The more urban people became, the more they were, as a trend, inclined to act and think in secular terms. But another one was very interesting, especially in Western Europe. The industrial working class, males, not so much females, males, tended dramatically to turn away from organized religion. As industrialization unfolded, now that was related to ideology, it was related to the emergence of socialism, the emergence of left-wing movements, which were explicitly secular. But as I hinted at last time, and believing me, I have not got a full-blown theory to explain this, there has always been a difference, a very important difference between men and women on this. There's been a very strong sort of current within, shall we say, male culture to say, you know, religion is for women. So and the more modernization played out, especially in certain segments of the population, you could say, well, you see, the trends are unfolding here in the direction that's expected. Problem with it is this. I said it was mixed. There were all these counter surges. Now, in this room, I have talked about, and others have talked about, the religious history of our own strain of Christianity, that is, Reformed Christianity. It is full of revival movements. I'm not using revival in the narrow sense, but in the broad sense. And that's not unique to us. I mean, Roman Catholicism has had its revival movements. And those revival movements have been sort of re-energizing, new interpretations, people flocking to organized religion. And so you get this very complicated pattern of, you might say, surges and declines, and surges and declines, and new sort of collections of people. Think of the American frontier, for example. And that's related, of course, to social and political causes. In our case, the case of our particular version of Protestant Christianity, it's been very closely linked to the struggles for, first of all, a new nation, and then subsequently the battle over slavery. Now, if religion were simply declining, then you wouldn't have these, upsurges of religiosity. And by the way, it continued all the way into the middle years of the 20th century. One of the most striking things that complicated people's reasoning about this was after the Second World War, there was this, in the American case, return to religion. And by the way, a lot of what National Capital Presbytery, which has over 100 churches, a lot of what that comes from is that period in which we were building churches all over Northern Virginia, all over Maryland, in order to meet this, quote, demand. Highly modern people. Highly modern people. Some of us in this room, you know, are sort of products of that. So I hope you see it. You could go all the way along and say, well, what was the state of things? Well, in some respects, more secular. In some respects, not so. Now, again, to make a long story very short, the response to this on the part of people who were the defenders of secularization theory always was the following. In the long run. All right, there are all these complications, surge here, surge there, up, down, but the long-term secular trend is towards increasing secularization. So down the road, it may take a long time, but down the road there's going to be, well, let me put it a little bit, maybe too graphically, there will be a society in which everybody's kids will play soccer on Sunday morning and they will not think twice about it. That's kind of sort of a practical definition of what a secular society. They won't think twice about it. They'll think it's just the obvious thing to do. All right, that's up to the 1960s. The 60s, it's generally recognized, you know, by people who write about this topic and discuss it, at least in the scholarly, are a kind of threat, a kind of turning. Now, I'm not going to go through a detailed history of what happened in the 60s because most of us know. But a couple of things stand out about the 60s in retrospect. Number one, it was an upheaval with respect to, shall we say, thinking about morality. And of course, a lot of the function of religion, not by any means its only function, but a lot of its function has to do with the regulation, the moral regulation of people's lives. That's a sociological way of talking about it, but we all know what that means. Especially with regard to, in the Catholic world, they're particularly sensitive to this, because of their struggles over this matter, the regulation of sexuality. I can't tell you how many people I have encountered at Georgetown of my generation who say, I used to be a Catholic. But in the 60s, you know, it usually trails off. I used to be a Catholic, but And of course, oftentimes there's some story about anger, you know, with this and that. But nonetheless, there's a feeling that among those people, that something happened there that really made it impossible or difficult for them as people to continue to embrace the church. There are, of course, a whole series of other issues. Women's roles changed dramatically. The gender change is a large part of this. And by the way, if you look within churches, churches can be differentiated dramatically on the basis of their response to the kind of breathtaking changes that have taken place in that regard, women's identity, women's roles. One of the defining features of mainline Protestant churches is that on the whole they've embraced those changes. Conservative Protestants haven't. Roman Catholics have. At least Roman Catholics have an official. So very important watershed. At any rate, you have a whole series of changes, an upheaval, let's call it that, an upheaval that takes place in the 1960s. In the Presbyterian case, that's particularly important because up to the middle of the 1960s, the Presbyterian churches, the mainline churches, of course initially it was North and South, were growing. By the middle of the 1960s, mainline Presbyterianism was the largest in terms of its population membership it had ever been, 4.5 million. And then, of course, a decline which frankly has been unfolding ever since. Now it's under 2 million. And of course, we're not alone in that regard. Mainline churches generally have have experienced that kind of change. But this was not just an American phenomenon, it was, at least in the industrialized world, the technologically advanced countries, a kind of global phenomenon, one country after another. In that period, I know well because I was living in Western Europe, traveling a lot, meeting various different people in different countries, and you could just see this upheaval unfold. Part of what happened in the 1960s was a dramatic turning away from a historic pattern. And that pattern was that people, on the whole, in their practice of religion as well as other things, duplicated the practice of their parents. Raised a Catholic, stay a Catholic. Raised a Presbyterian, stay a Presbyterian. Raised as a church person, stay a church person, etc. You begin to see, and of course, dramatically in the decades that followed, a sharp departure. A whole world of, another way to put it would be to say, a whole world of choice opens up. Now, it was in the 1960s. If you look at that bibliography, and those of you who have copies of it, if you look at that bibliography, you will see some references to something called secular theology. Secular theology. Which I must say, when I first encountered it as a theological student, I just thought it was terrific. I read Harvey Cox's book, The Secular City, like it was gospel. You know, just every page, yes, yes, yes. Underlining, just, but there are other examples. Same thing in a different idiom as John Robinson's famous, bestseller, Honest to God. It was just sort of a popularization of certain theological ideas that have been developed by Tillich and others. Now, the important thing to note about secular theology is this. It was a phenomenon of the 60s, period. Gone later. I mean, there were other ripples, but essentially it was a phenomenon of the 1960s, and the important thing to note about it is this. It was a kind of theological embrace of secularization theory. It might astonish you to hear that. Christian theologians embracing the logic of secularization theory, as I have been baptized it to be sure, sprinkled a little holy water on it, but essentially it was an embrace of the idea that modernization leads to secularization. And the clear idea was, this is providential. This is God's will. This is a good thing. Now, if you had been reading and writing about this topic in the 1960s, or even the early 1970s, as I suggested in my reference to one of my mentors in graduate school, you would probably have said what's going to happen over the next 50 years is a kind of dramatic confirmation of the secularization thesis, because many people looked upon the 1960s as this is finally the moment when all of this ambiguity, all of this confusion about the evidence, on the one hand, that's going to fade away. You could summarize the story of the 1960s as it was being lived through by people like the theologians of the secular as this. This is a period of accelerated secularization, finally eliminating the ambiguity. For the longest time, we've been sort of, the evidence has been uncertain, but finally we're coming to the place here. We're seeing it dramatically. All this church stuff is just collapsing. It's fading away. By the way, another interesting part of that story, just as an aside, the 1960s were a period in which, at least among Protestants, and to some extent Roman Catholics, campus ministry in this country collapsed. Just the bottom fell out. It was a dramatic change. Up to that point, the campus ministry on the part of churches had been very effective. Collapsed. And it's really never recovered, in my opinion. Now, with that as background, let me turn to what has happened in the subsequent 50 years. The source of all the interesting debates that are now taking place. Why is the situation complicated? Why is the situation so complicated when it was expected to be, in the light of the 1960s, a clarification, a simplification? Well, here's the reason. I want to cite 4 things. You could probably cite 15. But there are 4 that are in my mind as I think about this. It's very difficult to come to clarity about this for the following reason. The first thing is Western Europe. What happened in Western Europe? What has happened in Western Europe with regard to religion, many of you know this well, is the following. It has been a dramatic confirmation of the claims made in the 1960s. On the whole, there are a few exceptions. Ray and I were talking about this before. Ireland is an exception. Interestingly enough, Switzerland is an exception. But on the whole, it is a dramatic confirmation of the claim modernization leads to secularization. And in a very short period of time. When Betty and I were in Scotland back a few years ago in that wonderful sabbatical year, I was just amazed. I think I've said it over and over again. I still can't get over it. Amazed at the extent to which the Church of Scotland has just faded. And it's faded literally in that period. I asked people there while we were there, you go into a church, beautiful church, sanctuary. I'm not talking about downtown Edinburgh, but sort of in the burbs. Beautiful church with a sanctuary that should, be filled up by 1,500 people. Big church. 70 people, all with hair of a certain color. And that's Sunday after Sunday. And then you ask, and that's not just one isolated place. That over and over again, the only place that's filled is downtown Edinburgh. And that's mainly, not entirely, but mainly tourists. Tourists come to see the Church of Scotland like a museum. Now, I assure you, this is a subject of great consternation and serious conversation among people in the Church of Scotland. Being there at the University of Edinburgh, I was able to have very interesting conversations with people at New College, sort of their equivalent of Princeton Seminary, I mean. One of the things they pointed out was in the 1960s, 1950s and 60s, they were experiencing the same surge of religiosity that we were experiencing here. Now, less than 10% of Scots identify with the Church of Scotland. And previously it was 70-80%. Less than 10%. Dramatic, precipitous decline in Christian baptisms, even Christian funerals. And that's not unique. One country after another in Western Europe, that's the pattern. It's a minority of the population who claim to believe in God. It's a smaller minority who claim to be actively involved in any religious community. The figure I've most commonly seen cited is somewhere in the range of 15% of people in the countries involved, and sometimes that's considered a generous estimate. And equally important, and by the way, this is another theme in the secularization writing, the public role of religion. Secularization has many different meanings. What you believe, what you practice, what goes on in the public life of nations, what's admissible in public debate. Well, there's been a dramatic marginalization of religion, especially Christianity, in one country after another. And of course, it's not just Western Europe, it's, you might say, the Western European diaspora too. Canada, Australia, one country after another. And these countries form a kind of community with regard to the issue of religion. So the first thing I want to say is, what has happened in the period from the 1960s to the present is that in one part of the world, which is hugely important for discussing our topic, there's been dramatic confirmation of the secularization thesis. But now we come, of course, to the complication. And the main thing I want to say at the beginning of this discussion of complications is to talk about the United States. Now, the claim that modernization leads naturally to secularization would probably lead to the conclusion that the United States would be one of the most secular countries in the world. But of course, at least by the usual measures, that's not the case at all. Indeed, if anything, there has actually been a surge in religiosity in the United States in the last 50 years. And of course, that's the thing probably that pops into people's minds when you hear my story about the professor who says, don't worry about religion. I mean, this is pre-moral majority, pre-religious right, all that stuff. But I want to go beyond that to focus on a couple of things that Peter Steinfeld brings into focus in that article. There's something in there that just astonishes all the rest of the industrialized world. And as some of you know, I can tell you from personal experience in conversations there in Edinburgh, it just amazes people. Your good card-carrying secular Scot looks at this and says, what is going on over there? Looks at me, Douglas, and says, what is he? And here's the thing. Peter Steinfeld's reports, if you read the article, you know, 60% of the American people claim to pray daily. Some more than once. Comparable percentages say religion is very important in my life. Now, just get your mind around that. That's a lot more people than watch the Super Bowl. That's a lot more. 60% of the American people, we're talking about, what, 190 million people? Now, I assure you, when you put a statistic like that out there, the initial response on the part of many, shall we say, people on the other side is that I just don't believe it. To dismiss it and say, what?
That was my initial response.
I just don't believe
Like
it.
if someone says, do you pray every day? Of course.
Well, all I want to say is, this is not, shall we say, an isolated phenomenon. 45% of the American people claim, and there's some evidence to support this, 45% of the American people claim to be actively connected to some religious community, church, synagogue, whatever. Again, those are huge numbers. Those are huge numbers. Now, we can do all kinds of interesting things with this, and to some extent, as we go along, I'll try to do a little more clarification. The United States is a big country. It's full of all kinds of pockets. You know, there's the South, there's New England, there's the far West, there's the Midwest, there's all that stuff. But still, by any normal reading of American life, I can put it this way, American life, it's a very different ethos, a very different society than these other technologically advanced countries. Just is.
Could you give us about the age group? Because a lot of 20 and 30-year-olds don't seem to be.
Well, the answer is I can't right now. I can do that. I can do that. And I think to some extent that's true, but only to some extent. Fair enough. But the fact of the matter is that there are younger people included in all these broad generalizations that are made. So the first thing is this. First enormous complication is this. The United States is a great outlier. And the obvious question, if you're trying to develop a theory about this, is what do you do with that outlier? And it's not a small outlier. It's a big, big outlier. And the question is, how do you make sense of it? Now, I don't want to deny that there are versions of modernization theory, secularization, which attempt to do this. But the fact of the matter is, something has happened in the United States with regard to religion in the last 50 years, which complicates the picture. Let me add, on that business about prayer, the numbers have actually increased. The percentage of the population who answer that question by saying, I pray on a regular basis, religion matters in my life, those numbers have actually increased over the last 50 years, not declined. All right, so we've got that. But it's not just, I've got up here the U.S. and then et cetera. And the et cetera is, well, how much time do we have? And here's what I mean by that. It's not just the United States, but in a number of places in the world, there has been a dramatic surge in religiosity. One of the most important surges in active religiosity in the history of the world. Now, I referred last time to my Islamic student, or ex-Islamic student, graduate student, talking to him about his family situation, and he said, you know, my family, going back in the home country, is more religious now than ever. Muslims. Now, there are all kinds of reasons I'm sure we could give it, but the fact of the matter is, his accounting of his middle-class, highly educated family is, we're more intensely religious than the family was a decade ago. And that's not an unusual story. That's a common story among Muslims in particular. I might add, particularly among Muslims who have emigrated, moved to Western Europe or moved to the United States, for example. And then there's this incredible phenomenon, both in East Africa and in China, of an explosion of expansion of Christianity. 100 million, by a conservative estimate, 100 million Chinese are now actively identified in one way or another with Christian churches. They may be house churches, but they're churches. John Lee, who's a member of the Company of Teachers, I think he's preached here, travels to China a lot, and I keep sort of probing him. I say, John, is that really accurate? He says, if anything, it's a conservative estimate. There's just been this explosion of effective Christian missionary activity, native, not missionaries from outside. Now, the obvious question is, as China undergoes this process of modernization, and that's clearly another part of the story, as it undergoes this process of modernization, why would it lead to a dramatic acceleration of rather strong religiosity and an attraction to Christianity? You got a theory.
Well, I'm sure you're going to tell us, and I know that was a rhetorical question, but they're trying to repress religion in China, right? So it's a way to rebel, and isn't like Scotland, England, all of those places, isn't the church part of the state?
It's a big part of it. I think you've got
So they're rebelling against their state by saying, bah.
Well,
And
well, fair enough. But
and of course here, it is kind of radical to go to church. Rachel and Eric go to church. So.
Well, I just want to say one thing about that. You've opened up a whole series of issues there. Some of them we'll try to get to, but my initial thought about that is there are many ways to rebel. This is a striking phenomenon. You could generalize from what I'm saying here by making the following observation. In the last 50 years, there has been an explosion of religious identification and, in many cases, intense religious practice. I mean, we all know there's a difference between casual religiosity. I go to church, twice a year. I do it. I'm a Christian, sort of, and the kind of thing which is really intense. It seems to me one of the most dramatic things that's happened in the last 50 years in many different parts of the world is a sort of gravitation on the part of large percentages of the population. Think of Pentecostals in Latin America. One of the big worries of Roman Catholics over the last 20 years. I'm sure a worry of this Pope. How do we counter this very effective Pentecostal outreach in Latin America? Well, that's intense religion.
Also the Philippines, by the way.
Pentecostals in the Philippines. I didn't even know that. All right, so Western Europe, Western European diaspora, steady movement of secularization. In much of the rest of the world, you could argue just the opposite thing is happening. The direction seems to be moving in a quite different trajectory. Yes, sir.
Well, I think about sort of the populations and so forth. It sounds to me like if you these places where you're talking about religiosity sort of growing actually represents the majority of the world's population. Western Europe is just not that big.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we move to the obvious conclusion. I mean, when you think about this sort of globally, man, but now let me complicate it even further. You're absolutely right. Globalization, of course, brings with it this migration of people. Now, one of the most fascinating things to me, as somebody who is interested in Western European politics, is the extent to which Western Europe's own politics on this topic are being complicated enormously by the presence of people from other parts of the world who are intensely religious. And it's not, I want to stress, just Muslims. I mean, Muslims are a crucial part of it. You know, think of all, everybody in this room knows what I'm talking about in terms of the tensions in France, the tensions in Germany, the tensions in this place and that place. Why? Coming from people who are saying, in effect, I am not going to be secular. And oftentimes families saying, we can all sympathize with this, my kids are not going to be like that. And sometimes that's part of the issue. But it's not just Muslims. It is, and again, it's kind of breathtaking to encounter. Sometimes it's Christians of color in a place like London. I'm told that the majority of people who go to church as Christians on a Sunday morning in London are people of color from Africa, from various other parts of the world, you know, who sort of are bringing to the discussion of religion in public life a whole different dynamic. Why? Because they are, again, intensely religious. Yes.
Yeah, I just was going to make this point, Bruce. My experience here is there's a race issue too. The identification. I mean, you said 60%. My guess is in the black community, in the Hispanic community, it is much higher. I'm also seeing in my work, and we see this with the president, a comfort with religiously based or infused language in social policy. I see this more and more unafraid than I've ever seen it in state after state I work in. But 2 points. One is the proportion of a race issue, both with Hispanic Pentecostals and with blacks in this country. And second, a lack of shyness about framing whether it's income equality or violence or whatever as a religiously informed issue as well as politically.
That's fascinating. And it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me. And by the way, you touched upon a very important subtle aspect. Lack of shyness. Well, what does that refer? I think everybody in this room knows what you're referring to, but let me just highlight it. Part of the, you might say, the subtle dynamic of secularization is creeping into the minds of people like ourselves to self-monitor, so that if I am basically concerned about the poor because I'm a person of faith, but if I'm thinking, in the public square I'm not supposed to say that, then I think of all kinds of secular language, and so I become, in your characterization, shy about expressing my faith. And I agree with you. I think there are parts of our population, Hispanics are another one, who are not so shy about this. I'm a person of faith, and faith is the main thing that pulls me in that direction. So, to anticipate something I'm going to talk about next week, there are actually people in Western Europe who are saying, in effect, we have got to rethink the assumption we made about the exclusion of religion from public life. Mm-hmm. We thought we had this settled. And now we've got a new population, an emerging new demographic, if you will, and we simply got to rethink it. Well, once again, I would say, big surprise. I mean, again, I want my professor, now deceased, to be able to be, I'd like to be able to confront him with that and say, I suppose the simple thing is be careful about predictions. Now let me complicate things one more time. The issue of age has been brought up, and thank you for doing that. I want to tie that in. We've been hearing for the last 30, 40 years a lot of talk in this general subject area about spirituality. People sometimes say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Indeed, sometimes people make a point of that distinction. I really am a spiritual person, but I'm not a religious person. And of course, generally what that means, not always, but generally what that means is a refusal to identify with communities in which religious activities go on. You might also almost say it's a kind of surrogate for personal or private religiosity. I'm not going to be one of those Presbyterians, or I'm not going to be one of those Roman Catholics, but privately I've got these beliefs and so on and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of things that could be said in explanation of, or articulation of what spirituality means, but I think to a general extent, we all know what's being suggested there. Or a related phenomenon, which is more recent. Religion without theism. Religion without God. And one of the citations in there is a very new book with that kind of title, Religion Without God. And the guy begins the book by talking about the importance of being religious even though I'm an atheist. What is going on? The importance of, but I think that's very significant. The importance of, and of course what he means is probably what most of us in this room engaging in cultic activities or something like cultic activities, singing hymns, and then of course there's this, as I said, this very sensitive issue, the rites that we engage in life's crucial moments. Very, very sort of symbolic rites, whatever their form. Now I bring this up for the following reason. I think first of all, I think it's very important. I'm not one of those people who dismisses it. I think it's very important. I think it is a cultural reality of some consequence. But here's what I want to say about it. This is not secularity. At least it's not secularity as traditionally understood. Let me stress that. It is not secularity as traditionally understood. Secularity as traditionally understood, you might say your grandfather's secularity, was something that was precisely designed to separate you from all of that stuff. All of that belief in transcendent realities, however they might be defined, all of those activities which have a kind of religious or quasi-religious character. Really secular person is somebody who walks away from all that stuff, is worldly in the sense that I spoke about earlier. Now, if you look carefully at the articulation of the idea of spirituality in our time, it's people saying, no, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be the old-fashioned secular person. Why don't you want to be? There's something about that that really I'm not comfortable with. I heard a marvelous debate, George, that sort of debate. Christopher Hitchens. You know that guy? Christopher Hitchens. Old-fashioned atheist, village atheist, making a lot of money off it, or he's now deceased, but writing books, sort of the old-fashioned atheist line. And he was debating a theologian, and I don't know, the debate was sort of a kabuki debate, sort of on the one hand, but on the other, I really think, frankly, he had too much scotch before this.
I always shows up.
Well, exactly. But there was that quality to it. You say, but I say, and sort of smart-aleck remarks. But here's the thing. It was not, from my point of view, it was certainly not enlightening, and it wasn't entertaining. But here's the thing which was interesting. After this, there was a big crowd, a lot of students. And afterwards, I said to some of the students that were there that I know, I said, how did you react to that? And one of them said, it was so old-fashioned. It was so old-fashioned. It was, I didn't relate to that at all. Now, I think that's, and I didn't have time to probe it, except I got the feeling that, well, it's this point I'm trying to make here, that spirituality is a reaction against not only sort of religion as it has been historically understood, but unbelief as historically understood. And a groping, that's the word I would use, a groping for something which has got spiritual substance to it. There's all kinds of difficulty about figuring out what that is and practicing. Now, I just want to underscore, that is not evidence of secularity. That is not evidence of secularity unless you interpret it, as the proponents of secularization theory do typically, as a halfway house on the way to unbelief. People say, that's what the generation on its way to unbelief does. They claim to be spiritual. Well, you can interpret it that way, but my own reading is that it's I'm sorry?
It's a halfway house back the other way too.
Well, exactly. And I think that's, at the very least, you've got to have an open mind about what exactly it amounts to, and it certainly, on its face, is not confirmation of the standard claims about secularization. Now, the obvious, we're out of time, fortunately for you. but here's where we're going with this. We've got, I hope you see, we've got a lot of complicated stuff trying to sort through. The big question, in the light of all this complexity, and I hope I know you've got a kind of a dizzy feeling. On the one hand, on the other, the evidence is complex. My question, as a student of this, but ultimately also as a church person, is this: how do we make sense of this? Now, as I say, there is a kind of sort of defensive reaction. I love to put it that way. Defensive reaction on the part of secularization theorists saying, "Oh, we can explain all this. Just give us revised standard version. And I'll talk about that next week." I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. I think this complicated mix of things that we've talked about here point in the direction of the need for a new theory, a different theory, a different understanding of what, well, the relationship between modernity and secularization, and by implication religion, is all about. Now, in the next talk, next Sunday, preview of coming attractions, I'll talk about some of those alternatives. There's been a lot of work done on this, and there's some interesting ideas, some of which I agree with, but that's for next week.